Every day, we hear about crime, maybe murder, burglary, or rape. But in just 2 days, Nazi soldiers massacred tens of thousands of Kiev men, women, and children, and a whole city was devastated. You might have heard bits and pieces about the Babi Yar massacre and the subsequent execution of the Nazi perpetrators, but can't fit the puzzle together. We've left no stone unturned to bring you the most accurate account of this pivotal moment in history. What was the fate of Nazi soldiers responsible for one of the darkest massacres? Let's go back to 1941, Operation Barbarossa. In 1941, the Soviet Union's authorities disregarded months of warnings from Western countries concerning German military buildup along its western frontiers. Germany and its Axis allies launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, achieving near-total tactical surprise. The Soviet troops were initially destroyed, and on the ground, the Soviet Air Force was annihilated. After German troops encircled millions of Soviet soldiers in the field due to a shortage of supplies and reinforcements, they had no choice but to surrender. The German army advanced into Soviet territory, accompanied by SS and police soldiers, particularly Einsatzgruppen, Nazi mobile assassination squads. The Einsatzgruppen's principal goal was to massacre Jews, communists, and anybody else deemed a threat to Germany's permanent control. Then started a brutal campaign of annihilation against the Soviet Union's Judeo-Bolshevik leadership, particularly the country's Jewish population. September 1941, at 4 a.m., German soldiers invaded Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and later integrated the city into the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. Prior to the invasion, Kiev had a Jewish population of around 160,000, or 20% of the total population. When the Germans invaded the city, there were still less than 60,000 Jews remaining. The bulk of them were women, children, the elderly, and the sick or incapacitated who were unable to flee. Following a series of explosions from Soviet mines that brought down the German headquarters and killed many soldiers and officials, the Germans used the sabotage as an excuse to slaughter the remaining Jewish residents. But how did they manage to get so many Jews? What tactic did they employ to get the unsuspecting Jews together? How the Jews were lured away and killed. On September 28, 1941, the Jews of Kiev were told to gather to be settled or transferred in the morning of September 29th. German officials organized well so that the roughly 30,000 Jews who arrived, unaware of their imminent doom, outnumbered the initial estimates of 5,000 to 6,000 participants. The city forced the victims to undress before transporting them to the Babi Yar ravine. Sonderkommando 4A, a special force under Einsatzgruppe C, targeted small groupings. Eyewitness testimony, such as that of truck driver Hofer, who recounted scenes of horror and getting the job done to the letter scared, states that the inmates who fought were beaten and shot in the neck by police marksmen on top of the already dead. The German order police screamed. Soldiers guarding the entrances through which victims were driven into the pits were quickly mobilized. At the instruction, another score of Jews rushed forward, and the rear soldier booted the last Jew in the behind as he escaped. The unfortunate Jews had reached the end of the pit, only to be met by snarling and shouting. Many others just stopped wondering what they saw in front of them. The long, deep, sandy trench had already been filled with many layers of bodies. There are corpses twisted against one another, and blood flows from head wounds. The mood was one of unimaginable violence. A queue of order police stood above the pit, their eyes filled with dead, weird light, their features blank, and their Mauser weapons ready. Several SS and Order police officers nearby smoked cigarettes, scarcely noticing the new arrivals. An Order police corporal yelled, then raised a Walther P-38 handgun at the newcomers. The corporal persisted, and the perplexed and scared Jews complied, lying flat over their brethren's still warm bodies. Guttural instructions flashed up the firing line, and Mausers were aimed down into the pit at the sobbing and quaking Jews. After a couple of salvos of bullets, everything became quiet. Babi Yar symbolizes Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. In September 1941, the Einsatzgruppen acquired its most heinous reputation by slaughtering 33,000 Jews in the Babi Yar ravine north of Kiev over 2 days. The remains from the slaughter were buried with lime and dirt and forgotten. However, this did not mark the end of the horrors. However, in August and September 1943, when panicked Germans fled the swiftly advancing Red Army, they chose to try to cover their atrocities at Babi Yar. Who was the SS? What were their roles in the mass killings? Next, we look at the state of the concentration camp in Syrets. The Syrets concentration camp. A concentration camp was established in 1942 in Syrets near Babi Yar, based on the previous summer camp of Kiev's pre-war Red Army garrison. SS Obersturmbannführer Erich Erlinger, leader of the security police and SD in Central Russia and Belarus, issued the specific order. Convicts were both male and female, and around 3,000 convicts were housed at any given time. The convicts included Jews, communists, Soviet prisoners of war, and Red Army partisans seized in the Kiev region. Erlinger hired a renowned person, SS Sturmbannführer Paul Otto Radomski. Radomski, according to a fellow SS officer, was a drinker who believed in primitive values in all aspects of life. He was an old combatant who joined the Nazi Party before 1930 and spent time in jail for a political killing. Under the appropriate conditions, such a thug provided the Nazis with a longtime friend of Reinhard Heydrich, which was very valuable under the wrong circumstances, and Syrets was one such occasion. The captives at Syrets starved in rudimentary wooden barracks or dugouts, with doors and steps rising from the ground level to keep them warm during the severe winter. Zobchenko, a Latvian SS member, claims that the whole Syrets concentration camp was encircled by high barbed wire fences with wires running across them carrying high-voltage electrical current. The guards at Syrets were from the 23rd Latvian SS Police Battalion, which was formed in February 1942 and was engaged in several genocidal acts beginning in May 1942. This unit also carried out mass killings at the borders of Latvia, Russia, and Belarus, as well as on Pskov territory. The unit, together with regular German SS and other Latvian and Ukrainian auxiliaries, participated in the Babi Yar murder. The Latvians performed the customary guarding, patrolling, and prisoner management responsibilities. They were exceptionally violent, but the leadership and administration of the Syrets camp and its surroundings remained with the regular SS Totenkopfverbände. Syrets claimed a daily death rate of 10 to 15 casualties, despite estimates that over 25,000 detainees perished throughout the camp's existence. In the Syrets concentration camp, chances of escape were very, very slim. Almost entirely lit by electric lights, guards patrolled the area by night and stood all around the camp. The living zone was a carefully segregated area in the corner of the camp, with 2 guard posts. The zone was watched over by a row of towering walls manned by policemen with machine guns. According to former inmate Yakov Kappa, A women's camp was fenced off inside the camp, followed by a road, and then the 2 rows of dugouts also fenced in. On the left, right beside the entrance to zone number 2, they designated the first dugout for the Jews. A gallows was set up close to their dugout on the very day they arrived, and one man who tried to make a break for it was hanged. There was a row of dugouts along one side of the camp, each with its own name. The bigger, odd-numbered dugouts were reserved for authorities and put to use housing Soviet partisans and communists. Commandant Radomski was such a sadistic SOB that everyone was afraid of him, both the prisoners and the Latvian SS guards. As Karpe recalled, Sturmbannführer Radomski would also arrive at the lager in his car, and with his enormous German shepherd, Rex. The interpreter was Rhine, a fox toucher who sat behind him. The whole camp would learn of his arrival and tremble. The policeman waited with an attitude of attention, not wishing to give cause for a fault, though Radomski found fault with everything, real or imaginary. The only thing he enjoyed was torturing and killing people. As Kappa recalled, once he arrived, the Rottenführer on duty would report to Radomski, with Anton reporting next, who seemed to be a Czech SS sergeant running the camp that day. Radomski would lead him around the camp, his dog at his side. This tour sometimes lasted to dinner, but if the prisoners did not sing or march well enough to dinner, he made them march and sing instead of eating. Then, the whole camp would be put on the ranks, and a search would be conducted to find out who was responsible for that day or night's misfortune. Punishment for the severity of an incident was always painful and often fatal. There was a special table set up somewhere near the middle of the grounds to whip people. Karpe described being instructed by prisoners who were to be punished to take off their trousers and lie face down on the table. Then, they placed their necks and feet on the board so they could not move. Of the men in the ranks, the strongest were chosen to administer the designated number of blows. Also sadistic, Radomski forced prisoners to flog each other. In other words, they would beat each other so hard that flesh would fly, and anybody who didn't hit hard enough was tied to the table, so the others beat him. The beating often rendered the victim unable to get up, and Radomski shot him on the spot. Besides that, Sturmbannführer Radomski used his pistol a lot. Every hospital patient in there was also regularly cleared out by him. Sirets was a hospital that was always overflowing with the ill and dying, despite the difficult surroundings. The final result of the Babi Yar massacre was the gruesome murder of 33,771 Jews over 2 days between September 29th and 30th, 1941. Although we may be most familiar with this crime, it was but one element of the wider Operation Barbarossa, which totaled more than 3.5 million German and Axis forces. They finally would bring to justice the perpetrators of the Babi Yar massacre. The Soviet Union's invasion and the crimes resulting from its invasion remain among the worst in modern warfare. After the Babi Yar massacre, Germans covered the wall of ravine and hid bodies under heavy layers of earth. The victims' money, jewelry, pants, and clothes went to local ethnic Germans and the city's Nazi government. The dead were buried with the wounded. At least 33,771 Jews were culled in 2 days behind its walls, making it, in reports to the SS headquarters in Berlin, one of the biggest mass killings at a given place in World War II. In cases like these, eyewitness accounts are crucial. There's no better person to tell a story of a massacre than someone who managed to escape with a stroke of luck by lying down among dead bodies. Next, we see Dina Proncheva's account, eyewitness account of Dina Pronicheva. Dina Pronicheva is among at least 29 survivors. One of those who were ordered to be stripped naked marched to the ravine and shot. In her post-war testimony, Pronicheva recalled the horror she witnessed, how she saw men, women, old people, and children every time subjected to being made to strip off their clothing for a fresh group of the men, all being taken to an open pit to be shot down by submachine guns. Then, another bunch arrived. She saw the devastation firsthand. Out of the pit, she was far, but she could still hear panicked adults and children cry out, "Mother, mother," shortly before being shot. Pronicheva flung herself into the ditch and landed on a heap of bodies, pretending to be dead. At night, she slipped out of the mass grave and escaped. After the September 1941 massacre, the ravine at Babi Yar remained a killing ground for 2 years. German soldiers stationed in Kiev also killed tens of thousands of people here, including Jews, patients from a nearby mental institution, Roma and Sinti, Soviet prisoners of war, and non-Jewish citizens. During the German occupation, it is believed more than 100,000 people were massacred at Babi Yar. And as the Red Army advanced on Kiev in the summer of 1943, the Germans already began to try to conceal the mass executions. To excavate mass graves and burn the victims' bones, they recruited convicts from the nearby Sirets detention camp. Once the operation was finished, the Germans killed most of these detainees, but a few managed to escape. After they managed to escape, in November 1943, they testified to Soviet authorities. Many on the island turned a blood-cold eye and said nothing. Others were apathetic. Others were pleased to see the Jews go. Some of the locals committed themselves directly to the persecution and killing of Jews. Yet several tried to assist the Jews, despite the risk involved. Yente Petrovskaya survived only by ignoring Babi Yar's order to go to the meeting place. Instead, they took cover with Chaplinsky and his wife, Nadezhda, and their 15-year-old son, Anatoly, who protected them until the liberation of Kiev on November 6, 1943. After the war, the Jews who were rescued and their rescuers became friends. Some of these individuals were heartless sadists who loved to kill and torture. Having heard Pronicheva's testimony, let's find out about how the Nazis tried to hide their atrocities, destruction of evidence, and key perpetrators. As the Soviets reclaimed lost regions and marched into Poland, the Germans were more afraid that the world would uncover proof of their crimes, especially those carried out by Einsatz organization and later Aktion Reinhardt. Before his murder, Heydrich entrusted SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel, a participant in the Babi Yar massacre, to supervise the destruction of all evidence of Nazi killing, dubbed Sondaktion 1005. This evidence included the hurriedly buried dead from shooting and gassing operations. Paul Blobel was born in 1894 in Potsdam, a city near Berlin. He was a soldier of World War I and received the Iron Cross First Class. Blobel joined the Nazi Party and the SS in 1933 after losing his work as an architect during the Great Depression of 1931. He worked as a police officer in Düsseldorf before joining the SD in 1934. Blobel headed Sonderkommando 4A, a unit of Einsatzgruppe C in Ukraine, during the Soviet Union's invasion in June 1941. His battalion was responsible for the extermination of whole Jewish communities, notably the infamous Babi Yar massacre near Kiev. Blobel's drinking finally led to his transfer to other tasks after finishing the cleaning effort. Reinhard Heydrich's unexpected death in Prague at the hands of British-trained SOE agents delayed the commencement of Sonderaction until the head of the Gestapo, SS Gruppenführer Heinrich Müller, personally took charge at the end of June 1942. Müller issued the necessary orders to Blobel, and the process of disposing of the corpses began with some grim experiments at Kulmhof concentration camp. Initially, Globoknik tried destroying corpses using incendiary bombs, but the explosions set fire to the nearby forest. The most efficient method was giant pyres constructed on iron grills. Alternate layers of corpses and firewood were placed on metal railway tracks installed over large pits, allowing air to circulate below and feed the flames. Bone fragments recovered from the pits were pounded to dust by hand or using special grinding machines. The ashes and fragments were then mixed with sand and disposed of, leaving absolutely no trace of the victims. This method was first used at the Sobibor extermination camp and then at Belzec in November 1942 and later extended to Treblinka. One reason for the Nazis' obsession with erasing all traces of their crimes was the discovery they made near Smolensk in 1943. The site, called Katyn, contained the hastily buried corpses of 22,000 Polish officers, police, and intelligentsia executed by the Soviet NKVD on Stalin's order in 1940. When the Germans stumbled upon the mass grave in April 1943, they found the bodies well preserved. Dr. Joseph Goebbels immediately recognized the enormous propaganda value of the discovery. The entire site was carefully excavated, photographed, and filmed, and the evidence of the Soviet war crime was distributed widely. The Nazis even brought in British and American officers from prisoner of war camps to show them the evidence of Soviet brutality. Officially, the Western Allies blamed the Germans for the massacre, not wanting to anger their Soviet ally, but many in London and Washington, D.C. privately realized that Stalin was as ruthless as Hitler. The Germans hoped to create a fracture in the relationship between the Allies, but this did not occur. Instead, the discovery at Katyn accelerated German efforts to dispose of the evidence of their own similar crimes, as any such discovery by the Soviets would completely undermine Goebbels' efforts to demonize the USSR in the eyes of the world. The effort to destroy the corpses was already running at full pace at Belzec extermination camp, where the task was completed by March 1943. The work at Treblinka continued until the end of July. The Einsatzgruppen and massacres that had preceded Action Reinhardt had left literal mountains of corpses lying in shallow graves. Apart from Babi Yar at Ponary in northern Poland, 100,000 people, including 70,000 Jews, had been shot. At Ninth Fort in Lithuania, 10,000 Jews lay buried, and at Branikova, northeast of Sobibor, another 50,000 Jews were interred. All of these locations needed to be sanitized quickly. At Babi Yar, the grim task of disposing of the corpses was assigned to the inmates of the Sierets concentration camp. They worked in Sonderkommandos. Prisoner David Budnick recalled that they were led to Babi Yar, and every fifth man was brought before a stocky individual who we later learned had been an ironsmith. The feet of the chosen prisoners were cuffed into primitive clamps, similar to those on a chain in a well, which allowed us to work but not run away. Then we were led into a barracks where there were more prisoners. The barracks were located about 100 to 150 meters from the main Sierets camp and therefore did not have electrified fences. The rest of the prisoners, those who had not been chained, were loaded into vans and taken to Germany for transfer to other concentration camps. Along the periphery of Babi Yar, screens were installed to camouflage the area, and the whole region was declared restricted. Trees were planted to hide the area from planes flying overhead. The SS met any prisoner resistance or disobedience with summary execution, and the resulting bodies were added to the decomposed corpses to be burned. Giant funeral pyres were quickly erected to handle the mass of corpses, while others on the commandos were tasked with excavating the grave pits and hauling the bodies to the burning areas. Yakov Kappa, a commando member, described the process that at first they brought stones taken from the Jewish cemetery. The tombstones bore the dates of those buried in the cemetery. Long railway rails were placed on the stones, and then iron fences were removed from the cemetery and placed on top. Logs with a little space in between to allow air to circulate were then added. When everything was ready, the prisoners were ordered to pull the corpses out and place them on the furnaces. Special tools were prepared for this task, including a handle in the form of a ring and a rod 50 to 60 centimeters long with a sharpened hook at the end. The hook was inserted under the chin of the corpse, and a small team of prisoners would pull the body from the grave. Germans supervised everything, using bullwhips to keep the prisoners working fast. It was clear to everyone involved that the SS would not permit these workers to live after carrying out such a sensitive and secret task. They were living on borrowed time. Next, we see the trial, how the soldiers were sentenced. The Kiev Nuremberg trial. Some of the culprits in the Babi Yar massacre were eventually brought to justice. 15 German police officers were convicted in Kiev in January 1946 for their crimes in Babi Yar and in other atrocities. The Kiev Nuremberg trial lasted from January 7th to 28, 1946. At the trials, 15 German and Austrian police and gendarmerie officers from the Kiev area were prosecuted and condemned for the murder and torture of civilians and prisoners of war. Dina Pronicheva, one of the survivors, testified on January 24 during the opening of the Soviet-Ukrainian film. She reported the incident at Babi Yar, naked and with Germans ruthlessly beating them and setting dogs on them. Some begged for mercy, some quietly stripped and walked to the ditch unprotesting. Some ran mad. The Germans marched them in single columns through an earthen wall entrance and shot them with a machine gun. Pronicheva's testimony and other evidence convicted 12 of the 15 accused German prisoners of war to death. Among them, there were high-ranking police officers such as Paul Scheer, Lieutenant General of Police, who previously directed the security police and gendarmerie Kiev and Poltava. Paul Scheer was accused of enforcing punitive action, destroying communities, and shooting those who had been forced from their homes. SS Obersturmbannführer Georg Heinisch, the former Melitopol district commissar, was sentenced to death for ordering the killing of 3,000 children in October 1942, as well as 14,000 people in total during the occupation. He was also convicted of transporting 1,100 people to Germany, shutting schools and forcing youngsters to work. Another Lieutenant General of Police, Karl Burkhardt, carried out mass exterminations of Soviet citizens in the name of fighting Soviet partisans. An SS Viking Division member shouldered responsibility for killing people, women, the elderly, and children in the Lviv region. Eisenman admitted personally shooting more than 120 people during the trial. The unlucky 12 sentenced men were executed on the 29th of January 1946 in Kiev's Kalinin Square, an execution which became a nightmare theater. Some 200,000 people gathered in what is now Independence Square to see the spectacle. 12 prisoners were taken by 6 vehicles to the gallows, where nooses were slung before thousands. On the platform stood 2 prisoners in each vehicle. An official delivered a speech shortly before the execution, ending with, "Shortly before the execution." The condemned Nazis then hung as the trucks moved on. The rope around Lieutenant Colonel Georg Truckenbrod's neck broke. While there had been an old custom that men whose rope breaks should be saved, the mob insisted upon his re-execution, and he was hanged again. Crippled persons who had suffered at the hands of the Nazis twisted the hung bodies and hit them with crutches. The audience applauded. The remains were removed and buried at a certain place only in the evening. On January 29, 1946, the last public hanging in Kiev's history occurred. The 12 men were eventually executed. There are still many more war criminals involved in this massacre that are wanted for their roles in the atrocities. Thank you all for joining us as we continue to learn about how the soldiers who perpetrated atrocities were brought to book. If you found this informative, please like, subscribe, and share. In the comments, let us know what stood out for you. Stay tuned for more stories that reveal hidden truths from around the world.